From here, the train climbs nearly 3,000 feet in just 20 miles. That's a grade steep enough that, for decades, this was considered one of the most difficult railroad building feats ever attempted. You can feel it in the engine. You can see it in the drop. 1997, gold was found in the Klondike, and the world went a little insane. Tens of thousands of people showed up in this tiny Alaskan port town with nothing but a dream and, if they were lucky, a ton of supplies, because Canadian law required it before you could cross the border. There was no railroad yet, just two brutal routes over the mountains, the steep, deadly Chilkoot Trail, or the longer White Pass, nicknamed grimly, the Dead Horse Trail, for all the pack animals that didn't survive it. So in 1898, they decided to blast a railroad straight through the mountains instead. It took over 30,000 workers, more than 2 years, and, because gold rushes don't wait for infrastructure, by the time the last spike was driven in 1900, the rush was basically over. But the railroad stayed, and so did the views. Off to the side, you can still see the ghosts of the original railroad. Old steel and timber trestle bridges, abandoned when the route was rebuilt or realigned over the decades. They've been sitting out here for the better part of a century, rusting quietly in the wilderness, too remote for anyone to bother tearing them down. They're not just relics, they're proof of how much effort it took just to keep this line running at all. Every so often you'll spot old sections of narrow gauge track running parallel to the working line, or trailing off into the brush entirely. Leftovers from branch lines, siding spurs, and construction-era routing that never made it into the modern railway. The Yukon doesn't tear things down. It just lets the wilderness slowly take them back. This is the shot that explains the whole railroad. Watch the train bend around the mountain, the front cars already curling out of sight while the rear cars are still behind us. Every curve like this had to be blasted, graded, and laid by hand, on a ledge barely wider than the train itself. It's called the Scenic Railway of the world for a reason, and this is exactly why. Down below, the water is almost unnervingly clear, fed straight from glaciers higher up in the range. It's cold enough to numb your hand in seconds, and clean enough to see every rock on the bottom, even from up here. This whole landscape was carved by ice, and it's still being shaped by it today. And then, this. A second train, heading the other way, appears around the bend. For a few seconds, the two trains run side by side, and everyone on board does the same thing without thinking about it. They wave. Strangers, on two trains going opposite directions, on a railroad built for gold miners, waving at each other like old friends. It's a small moment, but it might be the best one of the whole ride. This is the shot that explains the whole railroad. Watch the train bend around the mountain. The front cars already curling out of sight while the rear cars are still behind us. Every curve like this had to be blasted, graded, and laid by hand, on a ledge barely wider than the train itself. It's called the Scenic Railway of the world for a reason, and this is exactly why. Near the top, the trees start to thin out and the whole world opens up. Jagged peaks in every direction. Skagway Harbor, small and distant, far below where we started. This is White Pass Summit, the border between Alaska and Canada, and the highest point on the entire line. From sea level to here, in 20 miles. The company behind the railroad. None of this runs by accident. Back down in Skagway sits the railroad shop complex, the roundhouse and repair yards where every locomotive and car on this line gets built, maintained, and kept alive. Some of these machines are pushing 80 years old, and they're still out here climbing a mountain every single day. That doesn't happen without a crew that knows this equipment inside and out. The company itself goes back to 1898, when a British financier named Close, an American contractor named Michael Haney, and a small army of laborers took on a route that most railroad engineers had already written off as impossible. They finished it in 27 months, blasting, grading, and laying track by hand through mountains that don't forgive mistakes. By the time the last spike went in near Carcross in 1900, the gold rush that inspired it all was already fading. So the White Pass and Yukon route did something the mining companies didn't. It adapted. It hauled ore. It ran riverboats and buses, and even its own airline. During World War II, it became the backbone of the effort to build the Alaska Highway, running as many as 38 trains in a single day to keep men and material moving north. By the 1950s, it was one of the only narrow-gauge railroads in North America still standing, and one of the first to pioneer the shipping container system the entire world now takes for granted. Then, in 1982, the mines it depended on shut down almost overnight, and so did the railroad. 6 years later, a handful of people bet that travelers would pay to see what miners once had to survive. They were right. What reopened in 1988 as a small tourist operation now carries several 100,000 passengers a year, and the railroad still holds the title it earned back in 1994, an International Historic Civil Engineering landmark, in the same company as the Eiffel Tower and the Statue of Liberty. Shop floor detail, hands-on maintenance, old and new equipment side by side, every wheel, every rail, every engine we rode behind today gets its start right here, in a shop crew's hands, in a town of about 1,000 people, keeping a 125-year-old idea running one more season.